authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce, the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today, once again, is Robert Curran, who's been, well, by now I would call him a frequent visitor of mine, thank God. And he's always a fantastic guest. He researches all kinds of folklore, a lot of it Irish, but, you know, actually from all over the place. The man travels the world. And he knows so many interesting things that most people do not know that, you know, who better to come on my show during Halloween and talk about goblins and ghouls and zombies or other creatures of the night than the man who has probably studied it more than anybody else that I could think of off the back of my mind. I just had to invite him to come out here and say hi to you folks and here's some of his stuff, because I think it's going to be a little bit more interesting than most. So, Bob, how you doing tonight?
How are you, Royce? Very good to hear you, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
Well, I want to thank you for coming onto the show again. I realize ordinarily when you come on an interview, we're discussing one of your books, but this time I wanted to do something different and wanted to invite you on just for a fun day, you know, for the Halloween time, because you, like I say, you're just perfect. I figured you to be perfect for it because, I mean, Scotland, Ireland, even Europe and Welsh, all these places have got some of the most fascinating and Celtic, lore about Halloween and goblins and sprites and everything else. And I figured you know a lot about that. Am I not correct?
Well, I grew up in a mountain area, which this time was a fearful time of the year. You may know, maybe you didn't, that Halloween, we were talking about Halloween. Halloween used to be on the 13th of May, because that was an old Druidic festival.
I heard that. I mean, I read it somewhere.
That was set in Rome with an ancient festival there. And I think way back in this early 600s, one of the popes, I think it may have been Boniface the Fifth or something like that, or Boniface the Sixth, I'm not sure. It may even have been the fourth. But he declared this a day for celebrating Christian martyrs. That was the 13th of May. Another pope changed that to chime in with a festival, an old Druidic festival on the 1st of November. Now, the 1st of November over here is Samhain, Sanhain. And the Pope changed it so that it fitted in with this old festival. Samhain was both a festival and a god. Samhain was the god of death and darkness. And it was thought among the ancient Druids in both Ireland and Scotland and parts of France that on the 1st of November, which was, Samhain actually meant summer's end. It was the end of summer. As the dark began to encroach, that the god went around and began to gather up all the souls, the wandering souls, who had died within the previous year, and take them to their eternal reward. And this is still celebrated in parts of France, where Samhain is known as the Ankhou, Ankhou. Now, the Ankhou travels about the roads in a creaking cart, and he gathers up all the souls of those who are dead and takes them into the afterlife in his cart. Now, in Ireland, we have what is known as the Costa Bauer, the death coach, or the deaf coach, I should say, because it travels without a sound. Whenever I was very young, there was an old lady who lived down the road from us who talked about a coach which traveled the roads on these nights and lifted all the souls from the houses round about. It traveled so fast it set the very bushes along the sides of the road on fire. And I was very frightened of this, because fire is associated with this time of the year. Whenever I was very young, Royce, this time of the year, cattle were driven between two fires. I was brought up away up in the mountains. So, and the farmers drove cattle between two fires. And this was to cleanse them from all the evil and to keep evil from them, because the forces of the dark and the forces of death had great power at this time. The veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead, or the world of the fairies, or whatever you want, was very, very thin. And this was when they had their most power.
Now, did that also, by any chance, have any kind of link or connection further back, say, to walking through the fires of Moloch?
Well, at some of these gatherings, young men would leap over the fire. Whenever the fires had burned down, young men from the area would leap over the fire. Now, that, it was said, although my grandmother wouldn't tell me, but because I was far too young to know about these things, but this was to ensure fertility, because fire was one of the things which was associated with fertility. And I suppose as the nights drew in and grew dark, young men had other things on their mind whenever the darkness descended. So this was to keep them fertile for this part of the year. And yes, you had sort of smoke, and they leapt through the smoke. Cattle were driven through the smoke, and it was as if they were being driven into another world.
But it was also sort of like a purification ceremony, like you said earlier as well.
Absolutely. Purification, ensuring fertility. Sheep, I think, were also driven through because the lambing came at the end of January, and this was to ensure all sorts of fertility and things like that. But it was also a time of the dead, because on Halloween night, and for a couple of nights around that, whenever we gathered for food, for our meals, my grandmother would set an extra place at the table, and that was in case one of the dead walking past on the road would decide to come in and sit down. Now, you couldn't refuse a dead person anything to eat, because they were just it wasn't a ghost the way you would think of it, Royce. This was an actual walking dead person.
Kind of like a zombie?
Almost like a zombie. I remember being down with an old man. Now, this is about 10, 15 years ago. And the area that we were in, because Mary, my wife, came down with me, the area that we were in was a very rural area, way in southwest Fermanagh. And we were talking to an old man called George Sheridan, who now himself is dead. But he was telling me that on Halloween night, and for a couple of nights round Halloween, his dead grandfather came in and lifted the latch in the house and came in and sat in his usual chair beside the fire, which was left for him. And the only thing which he didn't do, he smoked a pipe, there was a drink of whiskey left for him. The only thing he didn't do was to speak, because it was thought that the speech was taken away. And George told me that he remembered climbing on his grandfather's knee and finding it very cold, the skin was touched very cold. And Mary was with me, and she said, he's having, whenever he went out, she says, he's having you on. He's making a joke. But he took me down to see his sister, and without any prompting, she told me exactly the same story. So, and I said, were you not scared? He says, why would I be scared? Because he says it was my grandfather, and I remembered him. And I said, well, what happened? Well, he said, after I had his drink and smoked his pipe and all, the family went on to bed and just left him sitting, and in the morning he was gone. He said he only came for a couple of years, and then that was the end of him, and his skin was the second time, his skin was very dry and very brown. But he said he was still recognizable as my grandfather. But whether or not that would be exactly the same as a zombie, you could argue that it maybe was, is a question which is open to interpretation.
I see. Well, let me ask you this, Bob. Do people in Ireland believe any of these folklores at all, or maybe just some people, or...
Well, again, Royce, it depends where you are. And I suppose what age you were born in. Whenever I was growing up, I tell my kids that I was 16 before I even saw a television. The area which I grew up in, I suppose, by modern day standards, was quite, if you like, and I'm putting this in inverted commas, primitive. I don't think it really was primitive, but by today's standards, and people today might say, because we had no electricity, we had no lights at night, things like that. And there was a great belief in the supernatural. There was a great belief in what the fairies could do to you. There was a great belief in what the powers were at this time of the year. Now, that was the way in which the people interpreted the world around them. For example, my grandmother used to keep a shop. And at night, people used to gather in our back room and talk and play music and stuff like that. But they had to walk home along dark and lightless roads. And maybe if there was no moon about or anything, the place was very scary. So they began to interpret various sounds and various places that they passed and things like that as maybe haunted or ghosts or fairies or things like that. In certain rural parts, even today, people in Ireland will still be a bit wary. Now, they may have television, they may have electric light, but they are still a bit wary about passing old ring forts or old standing stones or things like that after a certain time at night. And certainly at this time of the year, as the nights draw in. Now, tomorrow morning, I don't know whether you have this, we have what's called the time change, in which the clocks go back an hour.
Yeah, we got that.
I think you have it as daylight saving time or something like that. But we have, and that makes the evenings dark and twilight come on slightly earlier. So people are still in certain parts. Now, in the cities and stuff, they will sort of ridicule such stories and say, we're not superstitious. I still think, Royce, that in all of us, there is still a fear of the dark and of the unknown, and whenever you're on a lonely road which you don't know and it's getting dark, I still think you get sort of goosebumps running up and down your neck. So it depends. In answer to your question, it depends where you are. People now like to think of themselves as very sophisticated and not superstitious at all, but I still think that beneath the veneer of sophistication, there's still something rather primal which responds to the dark or to loneliness or to the unknown.
Can you think of any folklore legends that you think might have at least to say a certain core reality to them or a high likelihood of reality to them that are, say, kind of would scare the bejeebers out of you?
I think all folklore legends, because you have to ask yourself then, Royce, what does folklore do? Folklore interprets the world around you, given the information that you have available at the time. And certainly there are old stories which have come down which have at least some element of truth in them. For example, I remember speaking to a woman whose husband was supposed to be dead, and they had a wake for him. And they had the coffin sitting in the kitchen, and everybody had gathered round, and all of a sudden he sat up and looked around him. Now that would certainly scare me. What he had done, or what had happened, was he had gone into what we might call a cataleptic trance. It's a medical condition, and I have heard of it. In fact, I was in a house about 2 or 3 months ago in which there was a bell in the living room, and that was connected to a family vault which was at the side of the house. The house was quite big. And in the living room they had a bell connected to a family vault in case any of they were subject to things like catalepsy and stuff like that in an earlier time, and they were terrified of being buried alive. So they got up and rang the bell. I remember myself, and this really did scare me. You may know, Royce, that I started work as a grave digger, and we had a tradition whenever we were working in the mountain parishes, which is called breaking graves. If space was at burying space was at a premium, and there was a fresh burial, we could go to an allotment book. And if the grave was unmarked and if there had been no record of a burial there for 100 years, we were entitled to open it and use it for a fresh burial. So you began to do this, and you began to dig up old bits of coffins and stuff like this. And I remember working on digging up a coffin lid. And this really did scare. And whoever had been buried in the coffin had been quite wealthy because the coffin had been lined. But part of the lining was torn away, and the marks of the fingers were in the coffin lid.
Oh, wow.
And that was somebody who had been buried alive.
Now, I was about to say, that sounds like somebody was buried alive fighting to get out.
Absolutely. And that did frighten me because I know that can happen. Not so long ago, in your part of the world, in the United States, a woman was being prepared for burial, and an embalmer's assistant was working with her, and he noticed her eyelids fluttering. And the woman was alive and is still alive. So there is a form of reality behind this, where people can perhaps rise from the grave because they're not properly dead. There's all sorts of traditions, and once again, it's associations. For example, I used to visit a very old relative of mine who lived in as they say in this part of the world, a big barrack of a house, a large house, but she was more or less confined to one room. She was more or less bedridden, and she used a certain perfume. And long after she was dead, whenever I went into the room, I could still smell the perfume. Now, whether that wasn't something which was a remnant of her, or whether or not it was an association in my mind, because she used the perfume liberally, and I associated the room with the smell of the perfume, I don't know, but I could, and I didn't feel terribly comfortable with that. But that was just me. Other people came in and smelled and said nothing. But perhaps it was just in my mind, right? So there's real associations. There's perceived associations. You may have had something of an experience like yourself, where you experience maybe even hearing. And I've talked to people who have heard sounds associated with people whom they knew who were dead. They'd heard a voice, they'd heard a knock, they'd heard something like that. And maybe you have experienced something the same. So there may be external truths, there may be internal truths. So you take your pick.
Actually, I've had something that I thought was pretty weird, but it wouldn't scare the bejeebers out of me, but still kind of, think it's wicked. It'd be like I'd be at work, and I would just, inside of my head, hear my wife say Royce or honey, and then a minute or two later she'd be calling me.
Maybe you've been thinking about her. Maybe you have some form of communication. I have experienced something the same with Mary. Maybe Mary, I have thought I have heard her talking in the house when I've been maybe making myself a cup of tea, and I walked in and there's an email from her. So it could be a connection. There are portions of the brain, Royce, that we don't know what they do. So maybe there is something to do with telepathy with close and loved ones, or my grandmother, my father's mother, used to say that she could read people's thoughts. There was an instance where she got up in the morning, and I was staying with her at the time, and I came down, and there was a dead bird which was lying on the windowsill. And I assumed it had just flown into the grass. And she lifted the bird and she said, "There's a death in our family." And I said, "There's no death in our family, because my uncles and all were living all around the place." But one of her brothers died in Australia at the same time as she found the bird. So make of it what you will.
Well, let me ask you this here, Bob. I just got to know this one.
Yep.
When you were digging up this grave and you saw where this guy had been buried alive and was ripping the lining, and you could tell it was his finger marks in the cloth.
Okay.
What do you think you would have done if a friend of yours had tapped you on the back of your shoulder right about that time?
I wouldn't like to say on air what I might have said or done. Yes, the thing was, Royce, that we were digging for a burial the following day, and I was working alone in the place late in the evening. So that was. But you're talking about sounds and stuff. My grandfather told me a story, and perhaps you can share it with some of your listeners. When he was a young man, he worked as a farm labourer, and he worked for various farms round about. And he was working in a place where I was today, actually, way down in South Armagh, where he came from. And two brothers owned a farm on which he was a labourer. And on one of the farms that he was working on was what he called the stump of an old church. Now, there was the ruins of an old church which stood in the middle of a field. And he said the church had a very, very bad reputation. It was so old that nobody could remember when it was last used for worship. But it had an old bell tower which stood up, and the ruins of old walls, which were covered in ivy. Now, one of the brothers whom he worked for was going to put some young cattle in the field, and they were worried that the cattle would eat the ivy, and that they would get poisoned. So they sent my grandfather down to cut the ivy. Now, I have to tell you one thing more about the church. The church was so old that there was no burying ground attached. There was no graveyards attached to it. But set into the wall was a big rusted green door which led to an old family vault. Now, nobody could even remember the family that was buried there. So my grandfather went down to cut all this ivy down and cut and clear weeds and stuff like that. And he said he walked down the road and he carried a scythe and what we call a bellhook for cutting down stuff. And he passed a company of gypsies or tinkers on a camp by the side of the road, just down below the church. So he went down and the church was lying in ruins, and he said there were old bits of stone crosses and old angels carved in the stonework above his head. So he worked away at this, and he worked until about 6 o'clock at night, and he was cutting down. And then, as the sun was going down, he was very, very aware of a woman crying. And he heard it very, very distinctly. She was sobbing as though her heart would break. And he thought it was maybe one of the tinker women who had come up the road. And he went out to see what was wrong, and he was standing in the middle of the field at the old ruined church, and there wasn't nobody around him. There wasn't a being around him. All he could see was birds flying home to the trees around about. So he went back and he realized that the crying was coming from inside the church. And he went up. Now, the old green door, which had been set into the wall, was rusted so that it couldn't be opened. But whenever he put his ear to the door, he could hear the woman crying and sobbing. He went round to where the old tomb jutted out from the side of the wall. He thought maybe she had got in there, but there was no break in the brickwork and the stonework of the old tomb. But he could still hear it, and he decided to leave. So he left and came back the next day, and there wasn't a sound. And he finished his work, but he finished his work well before 6 o'clock, and left. So what was it? He used to sit back and say to me, what was it? Was it a ghost? Was it just some ancient sadness which was trapped in the stonework of the old church? Something that had happened years ago, and maybe had become part of the fabric of the old church. The church no longer stands because I drove past where he said that it stood just today. I drove past it about 12 o'clock midday. It has been long gone, but maybe the ghost is still crying there.
For authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce, the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today, once again, is Robert Curran, who's been, well, by now I would call him a frequent visitor of mine, thank God. And he's always a fantastic guest. He's the most. So, Bob, how you doing tonight?
How are you, Royce? Very good to hear you, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
Well, I want to thank you for coming onto the show again. I realize ordinarily when you come on an interview, we're discussing one of your books, but this time I wanted to do something different and wanted to invite you on just for a fun day, for the Halloween time, because like I say, you're just perfect. I figured you to be perfect for it because, I mean, Scotland, Ireland, even Europe and Welsh, all these places have got some of the most researches, all kinds of folklore, a lot of it Irish, but, actually from all over the place. The man travels the world, and he knows so many interesting things that most people do not know that, who better to come on my show during Halloween and talk about goblins and ghouls and zombies or other creatures of the night than the man who has probably studied it more than anybody else that I could think of off the back of my mind. I just had to invite him to come out here and say hi to you folks and hear some of his stuff, because I think it's going to be a little bit more interesting than fascinating and Celtic, lore about Halloween and goblins and sprites and everything else. And I figured you know a lot about that. Am I not correct?
Well, I grew up in a mountain area, which this time was a fearful time of the year. You may know, maybe you didn't, that Halloween, we're talking about Halloween. Halloween used to be on the 13th of May, because that was an old Druidic festival.
I heard that. I read it somewhere.
That was set in Rome with an ancient festival there. And I think way back in this early 600s, one of the popes, I think it may have been Boniface V or something like that, or Boniface VI, I'm not sure. It may even have been the fourth, but he declared this a day